Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here this morning. One of the things that was not mentioned in the opening statement when it comes to Bill C-65, I think a lot of Canadians are focused on one specific section that really shows, I think, the cynicism that the Liberals and NDP have rightfully earned from Canadians, was the changing or the attempt to change for this legislation the date of the election. I want to go back and talk, though. Yesterday, the NDP leader came out and gave unconditional confidence in the Liberals, and here we are 24 hours later talking about advancing what we call the NDP-Liberal Pension Protection Act. One of the things that I had some concerns about several months ago was that former NDP MP Daniel Blakey, who was in the NDP caucus at the time, in Minister Dominic LeBlanc, there were several CTV articles that said they've been working together in conjunction of bringing forward this legislation. First question is, could either of you confirm how many NDP MPs or staff were briefed and provided information before the bill was tabled?
I cannot.
So at PCO, and there's no record of any conversations or information by NDP MPs or staff.
I believe your question was about the number of meetings that Minister LeBlanc had with Mr. Blakey.
Anybody, PCO, PMO, anybody in the government that the NDP had access to in advance of the legislation being tabled.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I don't think it'll be a surprise for you to understand. I'm not in a position to, I don't have control of Mr. Blakey's timetable. I couldn't give you an assessment of the number of meetings that took place.
But and my point about briefings is that it was very clear in the CTV.ca article back from January where he had said he'd been working very closely with the government. Quote, there's been a fair amount of work done, and the headline of the article was that says the two parties have been quietly in talks to table electoral form legislation before the next federal vote. My point being is that there is, a coordination was clearly happened beforehand, but I want to get specifically about the consultations that you had done in advance. You talked about all the feedback you received and best practices. Whose idea was it to back the election up by a week from October 20th to October 27th?
So that's a proposal in the amended bill. What it speaks to is really the difficulty in today's multicultural society. You have a lot of cultural and religious observances that take place during the fall. It was found that October 20th, which was the fixed date election, or is the fixed date election because this bill hasn't passed, occurs at the same time as the Diwali Festival of Lights, which I believe is also occurring right now. So the question became how to find another date that better suited and didn't have that sort of conflict. What you try and do in these situations is you choose the date that is closest to the date. Like, you don't want to go too late into the season and get into December and heavy weather, and you don't want to go too early because that would break into
So it was moved from October 20th as proposed to October 27th.
Correct.
Do you track when provinces and territories are scheduled to have their own elections?
Yeah, that's one of the things that is brings into, and it's a very good point you raised, sir, that municipal elections, provincial elections, territorial elections are all things that need to be considered.
And here's the thing about, I appreciate you saying it's a good point, because here we had to move off of October 20th for the reasons it meant we'll go to October 27th. October 27th, there's a territorial election scheduled in Nunavut, which would impact tens of thousands of electors directly by having an election day on the same day. So I don't really think Canadians buy the argument that they had to be moved solely for that reason. And just coincidentally, what would happen, though, if the election date was backed up a week, is that several NDP and Liberal MPs who are likely to lose their seats in the next election would be guaranteed their pension because they, as opposed to missing it by a day, they get over by 6 days by doing so. Do you not think there's some cynicism there, though? I mean, when you go and say, well, we did it for Diwali, but when there's a territorial election, another election taking place in Nunavut on the same day and was known, is that really the true reason?
So just to get back to the sorts of considerations that were made, one is just whether or not it would be a continuous fall election. You wouldn't want to break with summer holidays through Labor Day, so some of the days in September weren't very good. If we move forward a week to October 13th, then that would conflict with Thanksgiving, which I think most people would agree would not be a a good choice. So the decision was made to make it October 27th.
And I think the considerations weren't anything more than trying to save their pensions and give the class of 2019, the group of Liberal and NDP MPs that are panicking, to secure their pensions. And it failed miserably because many Canadians were outraged at this blatant attempt of what it was. I'm going to ask, though, in the PMO and PCO, you track correspondence that comes in from Canadians to your office, correct? Through the Prime Minister's office and PCO?
I don't personally, but yes, it is tracked.
Would you be able to provide us the volume of correspondence that came in? I'd be very curious. I know my inbox as a member of Parliament was quite full of anger and frustration from Canadians about this blatant move for securing pensions. I'd be curious to know what the volume of correspondence and feedback, pushback, opposition, anger to what this was. Would you be able to provide us those numbers of how many pieces of correspondence have been received by the Prime Minister's office since C-65 was taken?
Just about 15 seconds here, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Chair, we will endeavour to do so.
Thank you very much, Mr. Duncan. Ms. Roman, Mr. Berthold, 5 minutes à vous.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Berthold, you have 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hello to our witnesses. I'd like to go back to what my colleague said earlier, this CTV 27th of January 2024 article that stated that Trudeau's teams are quietly preparing an electoral reform and will change the law. Is there any way in which you or anyone else in your office participated in these meetings between the Liberals and the NDP?
The SACA considerations, I attended, I believe, 2 meetings of that kind.
Et vous n'avez pas trouvé ça anormal?
And didn't you find it unusual, abnormal, that discussions about amending an Elections Act included only 2 political parties and excluded the others? You know, as a professional, as officers of the state, didn't you not find that odd? Mr. Sutherland.
So it's important to understand what my role was in those meetings, which was simply to provide background information and technical information.
Est-ce que vous pouvez vous engager à fournir?
Could you undertake to provide to us the information that you provided to the other 2 political parties? I think it would be important to ensure Canadians' confidence in the system, that they understand that all political parties had access to the same information that the Liberals and the NDP had at the time.
So my understanding is that the briefing was primarily oral. I will take a look at whether I had any materials, and if that's the case, I will provide them.
Est-ce que ces discussions vous ont servi à établir?
Did these discussions serve to allow you to draw up a draft of the proposed legislation that we are examining today?
My role was to, we had been working with the minister, developing a proposal, and we attended a meeting where the substance of that proposal was discussed. So at no time did I provide a draft to the
Mais vous avez quand même soumis des...
However, you nevertheless suggested amendments to the legislation, including a change of date, assistance at voting stations, based on the discussions that were held by 2 political parties discussing this matter together.
Just once again, Mr. Chair, my role was to provide information and response. It wasn't to initiate.
Est-ce que vous pouvez nous donner, fournir au comité les dates?
Could you provide to the committee the dates of these meetings, Mr. Sutherland?
Participer à ces rencontres.
And tell us who was involved.
I can't offhand, but I can look in my...
Mais est-ce que vous pouvez vous engager à nous fournir ces informations?
Please undertake to provide the information, so the dates of the meetings and who was present at the meetings.
Okay.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much. I'd also like to get back to a statement made by my colleague on the other side, Ms. Romanato on the other side, mentioning those who would benefit from a pension payment if we were to put off by 1 week the election date. Conservative MPs at issue voted against this bill that would put off the date because they're confident that they will win their coming elections. They don't need this change. So I just wanted to underscore that. Very important. How much time do I have left? 70 seconds. Thank you. Mr. Carr, I am highly concerned by Section 40 of the bill, stating that someone can turn up at the returning officer's desk and mark a party, even though there's none designated. So what would happen if there's basically no one who will be standing for election for that party? And if the candidate who stands for election decides not to represent themselves, if all the ballots are in a box, already, how will you know how to withdraw those particular ballots, given that there's no candidate anymore in that riding?
So the situation that you've laid out is one where someone marks a ballot with a party's name and that party doesn't choose to run a candidate?
Or a candidate just decided not to
They
se
withdraw?
retirer. Yeah. Comment allez-vous retrouver dans la boîte?
How will you fish back out of the box the ballots at issue?
I think it would simply not be counted. The vote wouldn't be counted because there's no candidate there.
Et s'il y a un candidat qui change, donc c'est pas...
And if another candidate steps in, if the candidate changes, it's not an issue if there's another party. So a person will have voted for a certain candidate thinking that that person will have turned up, will stand, but then as a new candidate, but the vote will still count for the new candidate?
In what is a rare circumstance, does happen from time to time where a candidate withdraws and another candidate comes forward to represent that same party. In that instance, if you had marked your ballot with the party's name, the candidate who officially represents that party would be the vote that would be counted, I would assume, unless you...
Yes, the way that electors vote is not changing. So the vote, if the name of the political party is written on the special ballot, it's deemed a vote for the candidate in that riding. If there is no candidate in that riding, that ballot would be spoiled and it would not count. So there has to be a candidate endorsed and in that riding for the ballot to count.
Merci.
Okay. Merci, Monsieur Clark.
Ms. Gill, welcome, and you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the committee for welcoming me, and thank you to Mr. Sutherland and Ms. Pereira for their testimony. Of course, one of the ideas underlying this bill to amend the Canada Elections Act is to increase accessibility to elections. You have listed a number of measures in this regard. Do you think that for someone who couldn't vote on a specific day, that they will be able to exercise their franchise at another point in time? It seems to be a really simple question, but it's the important one to ask, isn't it? Thank you for the question.
Variety of ways that we continue to work, or Elections Canada continues to work to make voting more accessible. Additional advanced polling days is one of them. Making the polls themselves accessible is another. A third is improving the vote by mail system, which allows Canadians to exercise their franchise in a different way. And these are all, sorry.
C'est bon. Non, c'est bon. Je voulais pas vous interrompre. Justement, j'en ai...
No, sorry to interrupt you, but indeed, those are 3 ways that are going to be advanced so that people can exercise their franchise. My question, or my next question at least, is with regard to the Diwali issue. For me, while of course there are other reasons, in the opinion of the Bloc Québécois, and I'll get back to those later, for that we question that date, but I think we can all agree that whatever the case, no one will be left out, and everyone will be able to vote whatever the date of the general election would be.
Même si quelqu'un souhaitait célébrer Diwali avec toutes les autres...
If someone wished to celebrate Diwali with all these other options in the early advanced polling days, this measure would not be necessary to ensure that people exercise their franchise.
And I appreciate what you're saying. I would hesitate to tell a Canadian that they can't vote on election day, but they can vote, 5 days earlier, and I don't know what their...
Sur le plan de la possibilité mathématique.
Yes, but mathematically speaking...
Mathematiquement, oui.
Yes, mathematically. Oh, good, thank you. So let me get on to 2 other points. About Diwali, of course, And I underscore this because the Bloc Québécois, of course, we are serious about ensuring that religious matters and the state are not on the same level. So we decide, and I think this is more of a comment than a question, that to change the date for such a reason, even with what you've told me, of course, that even adds to our opinion and advances our opinion to the effect that we should not change the date of the election. I've also heard from other colleagues the same thing, but for us, of course, this is a deep-seated issue about the reason for the change of the date for occult reasons. Perhaps it's being changed for other occult reasons or reasons that we don't have access to. But do you foresee any other arguments? Because to my mind, the argument being advanced is not valid. So what other arguments would there be to changing the date, even though mathematically, as you said, we can't change the date? So, I mean, we needn't change the date. Mathematically speaking, there are other dates on which people could vote. So is there something I'm missing here, or is there just nothing that I'm missing here at this point?
I think it's just the issue of making sure that Canadians can exercise their franchise on the election date, and the signal it sends to at least some part of the Canadian family that the election date occurs during a time when they're in religious observance.
En fait, en répondant à cette...
Yes, well, you've given me an answer, meaning that there is no other reason, because people could vote on the other days. Do I have any time left, Chair? A minute and 35 seconds. Wonderful. I'd like to get back to another topic that has been touched on, but new in Quebec next year will hold municipal elections. And once again, let's get back to accessibility, the ability to exercise your franchise. And also, we've been discussing cynicism. We would like to combat cynicism that affects politics. But here we'd have the elections at the same time, and there might be confusion. There might indeed be confusion. Electors might be sort of tired, electoral day out. Is this something that you took into account when you decided to propose these dates? And based on your aims for the amended act, do you think that this would be counter to the outcomes that you hope for?
Thank you for the question. Just speaking to the issue around religious and cultural conflicts, would just note that the Act currently already accounts for conflicts with religious and cultural days of significance, and that the election date could be...
En fait, je parlais des élections.
Well, look, I was speaking of Quebec elections, Quebec municipal elections that will be in conflict date-wise with the Canada's general election. And nothing about secularism in that question.
A variety of factors went into the consideration, and then what parliamentarians have before them is October 27th as the date. But you're right, municipal, provincial, territorial elections, as Mr. Duncan pointed out, are also things that need to be considered.
Donc,
but
si...
Malheureusement,
Je reviendrai.